everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The Man in the Snow. It was the winter of 2005, during Christmas vacation, when I returned to my snowy hometown after my first semester away at college. Everything felt familiar yet distant, the quiet roads and snow-covered trees whispering memories from years past. On my final night home, my friend and I decided to do something spontaneous and slightly reckless. Go sledding at 3 in the morning. We bundled up and headed out into the cold, lit only by the orange glow of streetlights reflecting off fresh snow. We laughed as we slid down the icy hill over and over again, embracing the carefree spirit of youth. But then, as we reached the top of the hill one last time, I was suddenly overtaken by a feeling I couldn't explain. My chest tightened. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. A chill ran deeper than the weather could explain. I put a hand on my friend's arm and told her we needed to leave now. She asked why, her breath curling in the cold air. But I couldn't give her anything other than a gut feeling. Something was wrong. We didn't argue. I think she saw it in my face. We got into her car and drove straight back to my parents' house. It was strange, because our town was the kind of place where no one locked their doors, where crime was almost non-existent, and where every neighbor knew your name. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. As soon as we got home, I locked all the doors and windows. I checked them twice. Some of the windows had been left unlocked, which didn't usually bother me, but that night it made my skin crawl. My flight back to school was only 4 hours away. I lay down and closed my eyes for a bit, but slept only 2 restless hours before waking with a start. The snow outside was still falling softly, and I stepped onto the porch to get one last breath of that crisp air before heading to the airport. I remember admiring the way the snow rested gently on the branches of the massive pine tree in our front yard. It had always reminded me of something magical, like a scene from a snow globe. But then I noticed something strange. The snow wasn't untouched. Instead, it was covered in heavy, man-sized footprints that wrapped around the tree and disappeared toward the backyard. I tried to explain it away. Maybe my uncle had been out for a smoke, or someone had come by and walked around. But the pit in my stomach deepened. It felt wrong. Familiar, even. That same anxious presence I'd felt earlier while sledding began to gnaw at me again. As I stood frozen in thought, I looked to my left and saw something that made my blood run cold. A large man was sprinting toward me. He looked to be nearly 300 pounds, at least 6 feet tall, and for his size he was alarmingly fast. His eyes were locked onto me with such intensity that it took my brain a moment to process what was happening. This wasn't a jog. He wasn't just running. He was charging at me. I wanted to move but couldn't. My limbs refused to obey, held down by sheer terror. It was only when he was nearly upon me that my body responded. I bolted for the front door, adrenaline overriding everything else. I flung the door open, slammed it shut behind me, and locked it with shaking hands. My breath came in gasps as I ran to the window, peeking out through the blinds. The man was standing on the porch, hand pressed to the glass. His face was calm, almost eerily so, like he wasn't surprised he hadn't gotten to me in time. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward a white van parked across the street. A second man was sitting inside, and he raised his hands in an exaggerated shrug as if saying, well. The man on the porch mirrored the gesture, then turned and walked back to the van. He got inside, and they drove off into the early morning darkness. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. None of it felt real, and yet the snow, the footprints, the look in his eyes, every detail was burned into my memory. I woke my friend, unable to keep this to myself, and we did a walkthrough of the entire house. The footprints weren't just by the tree. They had gone to every door and window, as if someone had been circling, testing entry points. We tried to find some logical explanation. Someone drunk. A prank. but no excuse could erase the way I felt when I locked eyes with that man. It wasn't just chance. I knew with absolute certainty that if I hadn't acted when I did, if I hadn't insisted we leave the hill, or if I hadn't locked those doors, I wouldn't be here to tell the story now. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I took my flight back to school but couldn't focus on anything the entire trip. Every face in the airport seemed sharper, more suspicious. Every glance felt loaded with possibility. I replayed the events over and over in my mind, each time coming back to the same sickening conclusion. That man had been there for me. It hadn't been random. Something had tipped him off to my presence, and he had come with a purpose. Whether it was a crime of opportunity or something more premeditated, I'll never know, but I trust my instinct now in a way I never did before. Even now, years later, I struggle to explain how a feeling could be so strong, so unshackably right. Some part of me recognized the danger before my mind could catch up. That inner warning saved my life. I've never gone sledding again. I've never looked at snow the same way. Either. There's a stillness to it, a deceptive silence that hides footprints too easily. Sometimes I wonder how long he'd been there, watching, waiting, if he'd been near us at the hill, if he followed us back, if he was already casing the house before we even pulled into the driveway. The not knowing is its own kind of terror. What haunts me most isn't the sprint, or the chase or the eerie cooperation between two strangers in the dark. It's the moment when he stood at the door, hand on the glass, and didn't try to break in. It was as if he knew it was over, like a failed hunt. The way he turned away so casually, so resigned. It felt like this wasn't his first attempt. It felt like he'd done this before. I often think about the second man, the one in the van. Why didn't he come help? Why did they communicate so silently, so easily? Like they didn't need to say a word to understand each other's roles. It was too smooth, too coordinated, and that thought alone makes me shiver more than the cold ever could. I live in a different city now, far from that quiet little town. But every winter, when the snow starts to fall and the air turns crisp, I find myself double-checking the locks on my doors. I glance out at the street more than usual. I notice footprints in fresh snow. It's not paranoia, it's instinct. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if someone else saw that man later. If someone else wasn't so lucky. I tell myself I'm safe now, that it was just one terrifying encounter. But deep down I know better. Evil doesn't disappear. It just moves on to the next house, the next porch, the next open door. Story 2. The babysitter and the basement. It was the summer of 1973, a time when neighborhoods felt safe, when doors were left unlocked, and when children played freely without the constant buzz of fear. I was only 6 years old, growing up in Madison, Wisconsin, on a street called Monica Lane. My mother was a nurse, and my father was a salesman, working opposite shifts so someone was usually home. Babysitters were only needed on special occasions, movie nights, dinners, little getaways. One of my babysitters was a girl named Vicky, a teenager from a few blocks over, who had watched me a handful of times. She was cheerful and kind, a sort of girl who'd do your hair and play dress up without ever seeming bored. I liked her. My parents liked her. No one had a reason not to. Back then the world felt simple. Safe. But safety is an illusion sometimes, and the cracks often show when it's too late to fill them in. I remember a hot summer day, the sun high in the sky, the kind of day when kids lose time in parks and playgrounds. I'd gone to the local park with some friends. They ran off to the monkey bars while I, more drawn to the quiet, padded toward the sandbox alone. That's when I saw Vicky. I remember the comfort I felt, the smile she gave me, and how naturally I ran to her side. We played in the sand, digging, shaping castles and laughing. Then she asked if I wanted something cold to drink. It was sweltering. My small hands were caked with grit, and I couldn't wait for a glass of water. I didn't hesitate. I took her hand and we walked together. She told me about puppies she had at her house, and asked if I wanted to see them. I was thrilled. That's the last clear moment I remember. The rest, for a long time, was blank. It wasn't until many years later, in conversation with my mother, that the memory returned in terrifying detail. We were reminiscing about places we had lived, and when Monica Lane came up, she paused, gave me a long look, and asked if I remembered being kidnapped. I thought she was joking. Then I saw her face change. She wasn't. She told me the story from her side, how she had realized I was missing, and 7 months pregnant with my sister, had sprinted through the neighborhood screaming my name. A neighbor's child told her they'd seen me with a young woman in the sandbox, but no one knew where we had gone. My mother ran from house to house, asking for help, calling the police, knocking on strangers' doors in desperation. A search party formed. It was chaos, but somehow someone recognized Vicky. The boys at the park remembered her. That's how they found the house. The police arrived at Vicky's home. She lived with her parents, who weren't home at the time. When they knocked, she answered the door casually, told them she hadn't seen me, and that she'd been home all day. The officers asked to come inside. She agreed. When they searched the house, they found me hidden in the basement. My mother said she never forgot the moment they called her to say I had been found. What she didn't know, and what I didn't remember until our conversation, was what had happened in that basement. As soon as she said it, the memories hit me like a flood. The box, the dogs, her voice, her hands. The terror I had buried came rushing back with a force that nearly knocked the breath out of me. I remembered standing in her kitchen, holding a glass of water, still clutching my excitement about the puppies. I remembered the sound of barking, coming from a stairway near the kitchen that led to the basement. She said the puppies were downstairs. I hesitated. The barking was loud, angry and aggressive, not the kind of noise a puppy makes. I told her I wanted to go home, over and over. I remember crying, feeling something in my chest break open with fear, but she grabbed my hand and dragged me down the stairs. I started screaming. She screamed back, told me to shut up, threatened to lock me in the cage with the dogs if I didn't behave. I was sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. Then, suddenly her voice changed, sweet syrupy. She told me it was just a game, that we were playing hide and seek. She told me to be quiet and not make a sound. She covered my mouth with masking tape and put me inside a large wooden box beside the dog kennel. She covered me with blankets and told me to stay hidden or the seekers would find me. The dogs were still barking, but more quietly now, growling low and pacing. I lay there, heart racing, body sweating, face soaked with tears. I could barely breathe. I peeled the tape off my mouth and cried silently, my body frozen in that dark, suffocating space. I thought about my dad. I thought about my mum. I hoped they were looking for me. I remember wondering if I would ever see them again. That was the most terrifying part, the uncertainty, not knowing if this was the end. Then I heard knocking, loud, angry pounding from upstairs, men's voices calling my name. The dogs went wild. I was shaking under the blankets, too afraid to move, too afraid not to. The wooden lid opened, and a man's face appeared above me. He was kind, gentle, soft-spoken. He asked my name, and I couldn't even answer. I just screamed and clung to him. I didn't want to let go. My dad had to pry me off of him when we got to the hospital. My parents took me in to be checked. I don't remember much after that, just the comfort of my mother's arms and the way my father's hands didn't stop trembling. Vicky was arrested, charged with attempted kidnapping. My family moved away not long after. My mom said Vicky's parents came to our door to beg for forgiveness, saying she didn't mean to hurt anyone. My dad nearly threw her father off the porch. We never spoke of it again. But I remember her face. I remember the calm she wore like a mask, the way she manipulated my trust. As a child, I believed everyone was good. I believed smiles were honest and that kindness was pure. That day shattered that innocence in a way I didn't understand until I was much older. I often wonder what would have happened if my mother hadn't reacted so quickly. If the police hadn't searched the house. If the boys in the park hadn't remembered her face. Would she have let me go? Would I have become a statistic? A flyer on a bulletin board? That's a question I try not to dwell on, but it lingers. It always lingers. The fear, the uncertainty, the darkness of that basement, those things don't go away. They just live with you, quiet and tucked behind the everyday rhythm of life. But some nights, when I close my eyes, I still see her. I still feel the damp wood against my back, the weight of the blankets, the sound of my own breath muffled by fear. Story 3. The fingers behind the door. It was about 10 years ago when I was 17, living in a small countryside village that barely earned the title of a town. The main features were a weather-worn church, a couple dozen old cottages, and more fields than people. It was the kind of place where you had to make your own fun. And I spent most of my summer holidays inside, gaming, scrolling through forums, and occasionally watching the hills sway outside my window. My parents and older sister worked during the day, leaving me alone in the house from late morning until early evening. It was quiet, peaceful in a way, with just the occasional hum of a tractor or birdsong drifting through the old windows. Our house was a quaint cottage with 2 rooms upstairs, mine and my sister's, and everything else downstairs. The ceilings upstairs slanted with the roof line, creating low crawl spaces behind each wall, each accessed by a tiny door barely 4 feet tall. These crawl spaces, or we called the crew spaces, were mostly used to store forgotten toys, Christmas decorations, and old clothes no one wanted to throw out. They were dark and dusty, and I'd always found them a bit eerie, especially because the doors to them could only be opened from the outside. Once, when I was younger, I got locked inside for a few terrifying minutes and never forgot the way panic tightened my chest in that stale, airless space. Still, I grew out of that fear and treated the crawl spaces as nothing more than old storage. My sister and I had separate doors to these spaces in our rooms, and the walls between us were thin enough that we could hear each other if we whispered. Our rooms were directly opposite each other at the top of the stairs, meaning when I left my door open, I could see straight into hers. One morning I woke to the familiar sound of rustling coming from her side of the crawl space. At first I thought nothing of it. We had mice now and then, and they often skittered through those walls like tiny shadows. I got up, wandered downstairs to make toast, and settled on the sofa for my usual morning routine. But as I half watched the television and sipped at a cup of tea, I became aware of movement upstairs, specifically in my sister's room. The floors were thin, and I could hear footsteps. That was strange, because she was supposed to be at work. I assumed she'd called in sick, or maybe come home early, though that wasn't like her. She hated sitting in her room for long stretches, especially with such a small TV and nothing but old posters on the wall to keep her company. A few hours passed, and something still felt off. I went back upstairs and sat in my room with the door open, occasionally glancing across the hall. The door to her room was closed, but every now and then I'd see a shadow pass beneath the crack of the door. It was subtle but undeniable. That's when I began to question what I'd assumed. If she was home, why hadn't I heard her come in? Why hadn't she gone downstairs at all? Why hadn't she responded to my knocks earlier? I got up, walked across the hall, and knocked gently on her door. No response. I tried again, louder this time. Nothing. I even called her name twice. Still silence. Feeling a bit foolish but also a little unnerved, I pushed open the door. Her room was empty. Perfectly still. No movement. No sound. No sister. I stepped in cautiously, glancing around to confirm what I was seeing. Then something caught my eye. At the far end of the room, the small crawl space door sat slightly ajar. Just beside it, I noticed a hole, barely big enough to slide a few fingers through, and that's exactly what I saw. 4 pale fingers, slowly retreating into the darkness, pulling the door shut from the inside. My heart lurched. My breath caught. For a moment my brain refused to accept it. It couldn't be real. Fingers. No, it must have been a trick of the light. But no, I had seen them move. Deliberate. Slow. Human. My entire body locked up in a kind of fear I hadn't felt since I was a child. Something, or someone was in the crawl space. I backed out of the room as quietly as I could, trying not to make the floor creak. I closed the door behind me and bolted to my room. My hands were shaking. For some reason, the only weapon I could find was a plastic rifle from Disneyland, a fake Winchester I'd won at a stall when I was 12. That wouldn't help. So I dropped it and grabbed one of my dad's golf clubs instead. I called my mother at work, barely keeping my voice steady, and explained everything. She worked just 5 minutes away and told me to stay in my room and lock the door. Within 10 minutes, she arrived with her manager, John, who insisted on coming along. I tried to explain the situation again, but I could see the disbelief in their eyes. Still, they followed me up the stairs. My mother didn't hesitate. She walked straight across the landing and yanked open the crawl space door in my sister's room. I stayed back, clutching the golf club. A beat passed. Then she called out a name, Chris. Her voice was a mix of shock and fury. Chris was my sister's boyfriend, someone I knew but hadn't seen around in a few days. My parents had told him to leave earlier that week because he'd overstayed his welcome, but instead of leaving, he had hidden in the crawl space, waiting for everyone to leave during the day. It turned out he and my sister had planned for him to stay another night in secret. When he realized I was home and directly opposite the only exit, he panicked and stayed hidden for hours. He was the one holding the door shut. My mother kicked him out immediately and told him never to come back. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the following weeks, we discovered money missing from my sister's room. Then, one day she found a collection of empty bottles. He had been urinating in them while hiding in the walls, and months later, his own mother found a small bag filled with feces hidden among their Christmas decorations. He had left it there while hiding in the crawl space next to my bed. It was Chris, stashing something unspeakable in our attic. It still haunts me to think about it. He had been feet away from me, watching, waiting, maybe even listening to my every move, and all that time, I had no idea. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't knocked, or if I had decided to open the crawl space myself. What would I have seen? What would he have done? Sometimes, I still hear things behind my walls, and I remember those fingers, quiet, still, patient. It reminds me that some dangers don't come from strangers in the night. Sometimes they live right beside you. Sometimes they already know your name. Story 4. The ghostly children at 30,000 feet. I work as a flight attendant for a national airline, primarily handling regional flights that use smaller single-aisle aircraft. Most days are routine, a blur of cabin checks, drink carts and reassuring passengers during turbulence. You get used to the rhythm. You find comfort in the structured environment, where everything from boarding to landing follows a predictable sequence. One particular flight, however, remains permanently etched in my memory. It still haunts me. It was a standard route on a Boeing 737. Nothing remarkable. We were cruising smoothly at altitude when the call came in from the cockpit. The captain's voice was calm but confused. He asked us, "Why are there two small children playing in front of the cockpit door?" Now, let me explain something important. On this aircraft, the front galley is directly adjacent to the cockpit. Since 9/11s, that area is under tight security. A closed-circuit television camera is mounted just outside the cockpit door, allowing the pilots to see everything that happens in that narrow space. The galley isn't large. It's only a few meters wide and houses the jump seats for the crew, an oven, storage compartments, and the door leading to the front exit. There's no room to miss anything or anyone, especially not two children playing. The captain described a little boy and a little girl. He said they were standing there, giggling, twirling in circles. Their images had appeared clearly on the KECT monitor in the cockpit. But from where I sat, just feet away from that space, I saw no one. I looked at my fellow crew member, who had been beside me during most of the flight. We shared a puzzled glance. Neither of us had seen any children approach that area. We would have noticed. It was impossible not to. It's such a tight space. You feel every presence there. And besides, no kids had been near the front of the plane the entire flight. We'd only had a handful of families on board, all seated in the back rows. We told the captain that no children had been near the cockpit. He didn't sound convinced. After a pause, he simply said, "All right, never mind." The call ended, but a chill settled over the galley like a shadow. When we landed, I thought that would be the end of it. Flights often bring strange moments, tired minds, odd coincidences, miscommunications. But the captain wasn't letting it go. Once we arrived at the hotel for our layover, he pulled me and the first officer aside. His face was pale, and I could tell the incident had truly unsettled him. He looked me dead in the eye and asked again, "Are you absolutely sure you didn't see the two kids at the cockpit door?" I nodded. "Yes, I was there. So was my partner. No one passed us." The first officer backed him up. We both saw them. A boy and a girl. Right there, standing in front of the door, just behind the crew seats. I felt a lump forming in my throat. The captain and first officer weren't just tired, They weren't playing a prank. There was genuine confusion and fear in their voices. They had both seen the children. On a monitor. Through a locked and secure kept feed that only shows what is right outside the cockpit door. But no one else had seen them. Not me. Not my fellow attendant. Not any of the passengers. I didn't know what to say. So I said nothing. That night I barely slept. My mind kept returning to the cockpit camera. I imagined the scene through the eyes of the pilots. 2 small figures dancing in front of the cockpit door. Children who were never really there. The next day, as we prepared for the return flight, the captain pulled me aside again. He asked if we had experienced anything similar on past flights. I hadn't. Neither had anyone else. But I could tell the incident had shaken him in a way he couldn't quite express. And honestly, it had shaken me too. I started to wonder if something had gone wrong with the sect fee system. But the tech team later confirmed there were no faults, no glitches. Everything was functioning normally. The footage, unfortunately, wasn't recorded. It was a live feed only, so we had no proof. Just memory. Just the image described by 2 highly trained pilots who were utterly convinced of what they saw. As time passed, the story stayed with us. We stopped talking about it out loud, but I knew we all thought about it every time we entered that front galley, every time we walked past the cockpit. Every time a shadow flickered at the edge of our vision, I began to avoid standing alone in that space during flights, especially at cruising altitude when things became quiet and still. I started checking the passenger list more carefully, confirming the ages of every traveler. I even asked a few discreet questions to families, trying to track if any child had wandered up front without our notice, but the answer was always the same. No one had moved. Everyone had stayed seated. One evening months later, I was chatting with an older flight attendant who had been with the airline for decades. I casually mentioned what had happened, unsure if I wanted to hear her take. She didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss me. She just nodded slowly and said, "That plane has a history." I asked what she meant. She lowered her voice and said, "A few years ago, a family died in a crash on a different route, same aircraft model. There were 2 kids, siblings. They were seated near the front when it happened. I didn't know what to say. I asked if anyone else had seen them since. She nodded again, slowly, almost reverently. "Once in a while," she said, "but only during calm skies. It's always a boy and a girl, never older than 7. That conversation stayed with me. It still does. I don't know if it was coincidence, imagination, or something beyond explanation, but I've stopped searching for answers. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Sometimes you simply bear witness. I've flown countless flights since then. I've served thousands of passengers. I've stood in the same galley, in the same uniform, smiling through every safety demonstration. But every now and then, when I glance at the cockpit door and catch the soft flicker of the sect monitor, I wonder if the children are there, watching, waiting, dancing just out of reach, in the silence between clouds. Not every haunting is violent. Not every presence means harm. But there's something profoundly unsettling about a ghostly glimpse in something innocent, something that doesn't belong, yet somehow does. A residue of tragedy, frozen in time. I don't talk about it with new crew members. I don't bring it up in flight debriefings. But if I ever see that image for myself, 2 children standing alone at 30,000 feet, I know I won't run. I'll simply whisper, "I see you," and close the door gently behind me. Story 5. Wendell and the Opera. I first met Wendell during my undergraduate years in the city. He was a panhandler who occupied the same busy street corner near campus. And what made him stand out wasn't just his tattered coat or weathered face. It was his voice. Wendell sang opera. Beautifully. Each note he sang floated through the air like a cry from another era, soft and resonant. A performance that felt completely out of place amid the bustle of students and honking taxis. I always had a policy not to give money directly to people on the street, preferring to donate to local charities. But Wendell broke that rule. There was something about him. Maybe it was the effort. Maybe it was the dignity he tried to preserve by performing rather than simply begging. Whatever it was, I started giving him change whenever I passed. At first, our interactions were short and simple. A smile, a thank you, a stay warm out there. But gradually, small talk turned into casual conversations. I learned that he was probably in his late 40s or early 50s, and despite his rough exterior, he was quick-witted, often cracking jokes or mimicking accents to make me laugh. He told me he had almost gone to college on a baseball scholarship before addiction derailed everything. I didn't pry. I just listened. Sometimes he'd say something surprisingly personal, about an ex-girlfriend, or a regret, and I'd respond with something equally shallow just to balance the exchange. It never felt threatening, just strange, like talking to someone from a parallel life that had gone sideways. My professor once saw me chatting with Wendell, and later warned me to be careful. He was kind about it, but firm. He told me that chronically homeless individuals in the city were often struggling with deep-rooted issues, mental illness, substance abuse, criminal history, and that forming a bond with someone in that state could invite danger I wasn't equipped to handle. At the time, I chalked it up to elitism, and the kind of jaded caution adults fall into. I thought I was being compassionate. I thought I was different. I was proud of my ability to see the human behind the situation. It wasn't about pity. It was about principle. That's what I told myself. So I kept talking to Wendell. One day, Wendell called me over while I was walking with my academic advisor. I introduced them quickly, just a polite nod before continuing on. Afterward, my advisor looked unsettled. He asked why Wendell knew my name. I laughed it off, said we'd chatted a few times. He gave me a look I'll never forget, concern wrapped in disappointment, and once again told me to reconsider. I didn't. I dismissed his concern as paranoia, but I couldn't forget the look, and I couldn't ignore how the next time I spoke to Wendell, his mood was suddenly off. He seemed irritable, distant, until he asked about my boyfriend, the one I was walking with. I told him that wasn't my boyfriend. It was my advisor. Just like that, Wendell brightened. Too quickly. Too much. From that day on, he started bringing me little gifts. A flower, a bottle cap, a piece of broken machinery. They weren't worth anything, but I understood the gesture. It was his way of giving something back. Still, something about it felt off. One day he brought me a locket. Not new, not clean, just old and cold in my palm. My roommate saw it and called it creepy. I called her elitist, but in the back of my mind, something had shifted. My professor, too, noticed the change and brought it up again. More seriously this time. We had a long conversation about boundaries, about self-preservation, about the thin line between kindness and naivete. That talk stayed with me. Then the pandemic hit, and classes went virtual. I moved back to my hometown to save money and be near family. Wendell vanished from my life without a trace, or so I thought. A few weeks into lockdown, I was watching a friend's Instagram story when something felt off. The sound in the background. It was Wendell singing opera, but the video wasn't from our college town. It was from my hometown, hundreds of miles away. I told myself it was coincidence. There are many street performers, after all. But then I got a call from a girl I barely knew back in high school. She said, "This is going to sound weird, but a homeless guy asked me about you." He knew details. My club volleyball team, my major, my advisor's name. I tried to stay rational. Maybe he saw someone wearing our school sweatshirt. Maybe he guessed. Still, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. I kept quiet about it. I didn't want to sound self-important. I thought I was just being paranoid. But eventually I returned to campus, and there he was, back on the same corner, same coat, same voice, as if nothing had happened. I stopped speaking to him. I didn't give him change. I tried to disappear. Then I left town again to visit my brother in another state. A few days into my stay, my brother called me to the door. He was furious, whisper yelling, "Are you seriously dating a 45-year-old guy and bringing him here during a pandemic?" I thought he was joking. Then I looked outside and froze. It was Wendell, cleaned up, shaved, dressed neatly, but it was him. I backed away from the door in shock. My brother thought I was confirming a secret relationship. I had to explain everything. When he finally understood, he turned serious and told Wendell to leave. Wendell wouldn't. He started shouting that I was his girlfriend, that he loved me, that he had come all this way to make things right. Then he punched through the glass of the front window. Blood ran down his hand as he screamed nonsensical things. Something about tests and fate, and not being stopped. I called the police. My brother held the door shut while Wendell tried to push through it, over and over, yelling into the wind. When the police arrived, they handcuffed Wendell without resistance, but as they led him away, he started to sing opera. Just like always. The same haunting voice that used to drift over sidewalks now echoed as he disappeared into the back of a cruiser. I sat down and cried, not just from fear but from shame. Shame for not seeing what was clearly unfolding, for mistaking obsession for kindness, for believing my good intentions could shield me from harm. My professor had tried to warn me, so had others. I thought I was right. I thought I was helping, but in reality, I was playing with fire. Now I know that some people carry pain that spills out in unpredictable ways. That boundaries matter, even when you're trying to do good. That empathy without caution can become a trap. I still remember Wendell's face through the glass. I still hear his voice in quiet moments. I don't know where he is now, but wherever he is, I hope we never meet again. Story 6. The Locked Bathroom. About 4 years ago, I was babysitting for a family friend. It was a quiet night, one I had assumed would be uneventful. The kids were already tucked into bed upstairs, and I settled onto the couch downstairs with a blanket and the TV on low volume. The hum of the house felt safe, familiar even, and I allowed my body to relax into the soft cushions while the flicker of the screen lit the dim room. Outside, the world was silent, the kind of stillness that feels thicker than it should. Time passed slowly, and I began to nod off into a light, dreamy sleep. Then, something stirred. I woke up suddenly, not with a start, but with confusion, like something had whispered to me, just loud enough to pull me from the edge of sleep. The house was dark, and at first everything seemed the same. I looked at the TV. The screen glowed gently. Nothing on it had changed. But then, as my senses caught up, I realized I had heard a sound. The unmistakable sound of the front door closing. It was subtle, like someone trying not to wake anyone up. But it was clear. I sat up, thinking perhaps the parents had come home early, though that wouldn't make much sense without a word or a call. As I reached for my phone, I noticed something important. There had been no sound of the lock turning. The front door had closed, yes, but it had not been locked afterward. That lock was loud, an echoing clunk that you couldn't mistake, but I hadn't heard it. Not even a click. I stood slowly, suddenly very aware of the creaks in the old wooden floor beneath my socks. My eyes darted toward the staircase, where I could barely make out the soft outline of the hallway above. The kids were asleep up there. I told myself not to panic, not to jump to conclusions. Maybe it really was one of the parents. Maybe they were just quietly grabbing something they'd forgotten. But something inside me had already begun to tremble. I strained my ears and heard it again. Soft footsteps moving around the front room, shuffling papers, as if someone were looking for something. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, unhurried but not relaxed. They didn't sound like the dad's footsteps. They were heavier, more tense. Every instinct told me something was wrong. I knew I wasn't brave enough to confront an intruder. At 15, I didn't even know where they kept anything resembling a weapon in this house. All I knew was that I had to protect myself and the kids. I crept along the wall, silently, making my way toward the stairs without making a sound. I positioned myself just out of view, peeking around the edge to listen. I heard more movement, footsteps growing closer, and then a door opening, but not the stairs, not the hallway, the bathroom. The footsteps had gone into the bathroom. I held my breath, every part of me frozen as I waited for the sound of the door closing or locking, but nothing came. The silence after that was more frightening than the noise. It was the kind of silence that dares you to breathe. Just then the front door opened again. This time it was loud, purposeful. And then I heard laughter, familiar voices. The mother and my own mum, returning from that night out. The warmth of their chatter filled the cold, tense space. I wanted to yell out, to warn them, but I stood frozen on the stairs, still listening for the bathroom door to open again. But it didn't. I heard their footsteps draw closer, their purses rustling as they dropped them on the table. shoes clicking against the floor, and no scream, no sudden gasp. They weren't reacting to anything. They walked straight past the bathroom without even a glance. They hadn't seen anyone, but I had heard someone go in. I had heard the door open. I hadn't imagined that. I walked downstairs with my heart in my throat. My eyes went straight to the bathroom. The door was wide open. No one was inside. The window was shut. The room was tiny, barely large enough for one person to stand in, let alone hide. There were no signs of forced entry or missing items. Nothing had been disturbed. I tried to calm myself with logic. Maybe I had dreamed it, but deep down, I knew the difference between real and imagined. I knew what I'd felt. The sudden awareness, the weight in the air. That wasn't a dream. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the memory. Every creak in the floor, every unexpected sound, made me glance over my shoulder. I stopped babysitting for a while. I never told the parents what happened. There was nothing to tell them. Not really, no break-in, no missing items, no physical evidence of an intruder. But something had been there. Someone had come into that house. I would never understand how they had gotten out without being seen, or why they had entered in the first place. But they had. I had felt their presence the way one feels a storm about to break, silent, still, and inevitable. It's easy to doubt yourself when nothing tangible confirms what you know in your gut, but sometimes the absence of evidence is more chilling than the evidence itself. That night didn't leave me with bruises or broken windows. It left me with questions. Was someone watching us from the outside? Had they been following me without my realizing it? Or had I stumbled into a moment I wasn't supposed to witness? Whatever it was, it didn't try to harm me. It simply disappeared, like a shadow passing through a room, leaving only the air stirred in its wake. To this day, when I walk past dark bathrooms or hear an unexplained sound behind a door, I pause. I listen. I wait for a moment, not out of fear, but out of respect for what I still can't explain. Maybe it was a drifter. Maybe it was a lost soul. Or maybe in some strange way the house was trying to warn me, letting me sense what I couldn't see. All I know is that I woke up for a reason that night. I was meant to be alert. I was meant to remember. And I have. Story 7. The Alley and the Suv. It happened a few years ago during the cold grip of winter. I was walking alone through a narrow alley on my way to meet my son's father at a local bar we used to frequent. It wasn't late, about 9 p.m., but the darkness made it feel like midnight. The streets around me were still, blanketed by soft snow, with only the occasional flicker of a porch light breaking the darkness. Despite the quiet and cold, there was something comforting about being outside alone. The air was clean, and the solitude helped clear my head after a long day. That peace, however, didn't last. As I neared the end of the alley, I noticed a man behind me, young, probably early 20s, about 50 feet back. At first, I didn't think anything of it. This was a neighborhood I'd walked through many times, but then he called out, "Hey, you." His voice was casual at first, like he was trying to get the attention of a friend. I turned around briefly, assuming he was talking to someone else. "Yeah, you. Don't turn around, sweetheart." This time, his voice changed. It carried a different tone, not playful, not friendly. I felt a twinge of unease and began walking faster. Then, just ahead of me, I noticed something even more concerning, and SUV idling in a driveway, facing outward. It had been backed in, blocking the sidewalk. The driver's door was already open. I turned back toward the man behind me, only to notice more movement. 5 or 6 more figures stepping out from behind tall piles of snow that lined the alley. They had been hiding, crouched low and waiting. Their timing was too precise, too coordinated. I stopped breathing. It was as if the snowbanks themselves had birthed these men. Some of them held their phones out filming. One stood by the SUV, motioning for me to approach. Another moved toward me slowly, smiling. My mind went blank for a second as the danger became undeniable. I was surrounded, outnumbered, trapped. The streetlights flickered off the snow, casting long shadows that danced around me. My instincts screamed at me to run. But where? In a sudden decision, I darted to my left, leaping over a narrow trench of frozen slush and sprinting across someone's yard. My boots dug into the icy ground. giving me the grip I needed. I didn't stop to look back. I just ran, my breath catching in the freezing air, my heart pounding louder than my footsteps. I could hear them behind me at first, yelling, trying to regroup, but the terrain slowed them down. I cut through another yard, stumbled over a fence, and finally emerged onto a familiar street that led to the bar. The lights of the building felt like salvation. I pushed open the door, stepped inside, and collapsed into the warmth. Inside, no one noticed my panic. The music was playing, glasses were clinking, and the bartender gave me a casual nod. I made my way to a corner, shaking, trying to collect myself. The group outside hadn't followed me into the building. Maybe they hadn't expected me to run. Maybe they were just trying to scare me. But the way they had positioned themselves, the way they waited, it didn't feel like a prank. It felt like a plan. And whatever was supposed to happen didn't. I sat there for a while, texting my son's father to let him know where I was. I didn't tell him the full story yet. I couldn't. I needed to believe it was over before I relived it. Eventually, I returned home. But the fear didn't leave me. It clung to me like the cold, settling into the corners of my mind and refusing to melt. I replayed the moment I had locked eyes with the man near the Suv. The way he smiled, not friendly, not kind, but empty, as if I weren't even a person. The others had been ready, phones out, like they had done it before, or worse, like they had planned to relive it afterward. That image haunted me. I kept wondering, what if I hadn't worn those boots? What if I'd slipped on the ice? What if I'd frozen up completely, caught in fear? I knew the answers, and none of them were good. In the days that followed, I reported the incident to a local community group, hoping to make others aware, but without names, license plates, or clear faces, there was little they could do. The bar's security cameras barely reached the street, and the alley was just outside their view. There was no proof of anything, only my word and a sickening feeling that I had barely escaped something far worse than intimidation. I started walking with pepper spray after that. My routes changed. I stopped using alleys altogether, even during the day. I avoided dim corners and kept my phone in my hand, screen open, ready to dial. My trust in the quiet familiarity of my neighborhood was gone. Winter didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt deceptive. The stillness had allowed something dark to lurk. Snow, I realized, muffled sound, footsteps, shouts, even breathing. That night, it had made the world too quiet, too easy for danger to move unnoticed. I thought about all the other nights I'd walked that same route, oblivious to the idea that someone could be hiding behind the mounds of plowed snow, watching, waiting. Now I couldn't unsee it. Every parked car became a potential trap. Every figure behind me a threat. The man who spoke to me first, his voice plays in my head sometimes, that calm tone masking something terrible underneath. "Don't turn around, sweetheart." As if he had rehearsed it, as if he expected me to follow. I don't know what would have happened if I had. I don't want to know. But the look in his eyes that night told me everything. There was no innocence, no misunderstanding, only intention. And that's what truly terrified me. The silence before the attack, the confidence in his stance, the coordination. I didn't just escape from a strange encounter. I escaped from something planned. Now, whenever I hear footsteps behind me or see a vehicle parked the wrong way, I feel that same pulse of dread. It's a survival instinct now. And maybe that's a good thing. It's kept me alert. It's kept me alive. Some people dismiss stories like these because nothing happened, but they don't understand. Something almost happened. And that's what matters. It's not the violence itself that haunts you. It's the nearness of it, the breath of it on your neck, the moment you realize how easily your life could have changed forever. Story 8. The face in the attic. There was a small, inconspicuous door in my bedroom that led to the attic space, and I never thought much of it at first. It was just one of those quirky things old houses have, an odd little entryway tucked beneath a slanted ceiling, opening into a dark crawl space. Every night, I would notice the door slightly open and instinctively close it before going to bed. It happened often enough that I simply assumed my mum must have been leaving it ajar while rummaging for holiday decorations or forgotten keepsakes. It didn't occur to me that something might be wrong until the habit repeated so consistently that it became unsettling. Then, one evening, in a moment of annoyance, I made a sarcastic comment to my mom about it. Something like, "Hey, next time you're in the attic, can you at least shut the door properly?" But she looked at me strangely, a bit confused. Then she told me she hadn't been in the attic for months. That stopped me cold. I asked my brother and father too, and both denied ever opening the attic recently. At first I brushed it off. Maybe someone had gone in months ago and never latched it properly. Maybe it swung open because of drafts or the settling of the house. But the more I checked it, the more I tracked it through the day, the more impossible it became to explain away. I started testing it. I would firmly shut the door before school, check it again when I got home, again after dinner, and then again before bed. Every time it was open again by nightfall. No sound, no movement, just open. It began to weigh on me. So one night, I decided not to close the door at all. I wanted to see what would happen if I left it open. I stared into that black rectangle across the room from my bed and tried to convince myself there was nothing to fear. It was just air, wood, dust, insulation, nothing more. But even as I lay beneath my blankets, I couldn't help but glance at it again and again. That gaping blackness seemed to pulse with silence, as if it were breathing. And that's when I saw it. A face, pale and still, staring directly back at me from the darkness of the attic. Not glowing, not monstrous, just there. Human, watching, unmoving. I froze completely, unable to scream, unable to move. My heart felt like it was folding in on itself. I couldn't tell how long we stared at each other, but it felt like time had stopped. When I finally found the strength, I bolted from bed, ran down the stairs, and woke my parents. My brother mocked me at first, but my parents took it seriously enough to check the space. They didn't find anything. But I refused to sleep in that room again. Eventually I switched bedrooms with my brother. It didn't matter that nothing was there when they checked. I knew what I'd seen, and even if it was just a trick of the light, even if I'd imagined it, something in me had changed. Something deep and instinctual had been triggered, and it wouldn't let go. 6 months later, we moved to a new house. I thought I had left the fear behind, until senior year, when a strange coincidence brought it all rushing back. My new physics teacher and his wife had bought our old home. Near the end of the school year, a friend and I were filming a silly video project using a camcorder. We decided to visit my old house and asked my teacher for a quick tour. He was kind enough to invite us in and walk us through the place. I pointed out old corners my dad had remodeled and shared some stories about growing up there. It was light-hearted, until we reached what used to be my room, now a sewing room. Half joking, I asked, "Have you noticed anything strange about this room?" His wife looked at me, and then at the attic door. Her expression darkened. She asked what I meant, and I laughed nervously. "The attic door," I said. "It used to open by itself all the time." She paused, then quietly confirmed that it still did. Every single time she came upstairs to sew, the attic door would be wide open, even after being shut the day before. Then, she told us something even more chilling. On their second day in the house, their German shepherd had walked into that room, stopped at the attic door, and began barking furiously. He wouldn't stop, wouldn't be calmed. Eventually, the dog leapt through the window onto the roof below and ran away. He didn't return until the next day, and never once stepped foot upstairs again. That conversation haunted me for months. I had always doubted what I saw, told myself it was imagination, but her story validated everything I had feared. It was no longer just a childhood memory. It was something real, something others had experienced. I considered showing the video to my family, trying to prove that I hadn't made it up, but I decided against it. What good would it do to reopen that fear? I let it be. I never wanted to think of that house again. But sometimes, the past doesn't let you walk away that easily. Sometimes it waits in dark corners, in silent rooms, in dusty attic crawl spaces. Looking back, I can't say for sure what the face in the attic was. A squatter, a trespasser, a ghost, or something else entirely. Maybe it was a person who had found a way into the walls, like the man who was caught hiding in someone's attic years later on the news. Or maybe it was a leftover presence from someone who had lived in the house long before we did. The possibilities swirled in my mind, none of them comforting. But what terrified me most wasn't the face itself, it was the silence of it. The way it just watched, unmoving, calm, as if it had always been there, as if it wasn't surprised to see me at all. The attic wasn't above the second floor. It was parallel to it, running alongside the rooms like a secret hallway wrapped around the meter of the upper level. When I told my family what I saw, my brother teased me relentlessly, but my father took it more seriously. One of the first things he said was that a house across the street had recently been robbed. Someone stole a coin collection. He checked our attic and found nothing. But I noticed the way he kept the door shut more tightly afterward. He never admitted it, but I think a part of him believed me, or at least didn't want to take any chances, and that was enough to confirm what I needed to know. To this day, I'm not sure whether I believe in ghosts, but I do believe in warnings, in gut feelings. In the quiet way a place can tell you that something isn't right. That house never felt warm. It never felt truly safe. And sometimes, when I pass houses with attic doors like mine, I wonder who or what is behind them, waiting for night to fall. The attic taught me something no book or lesson ever could. Sometimes the most terrifying thing in the world isn't what's hiding in the dark. It's the knowledge that it knows you're watching it too. Story 9. The Man in the Window. It happened when I was 15 years old, during one of those long, quiet summers when nothing seemed urgent and every day blurred into the next. I was staying at my grandmother's house in a sleepy little town bordered by woods and winding roads. Her home sat at the edge of a tree-lined street, with only a few scattered houses and an overgrown field that led to nowhere in particular. She lived alone, but the neighborhood was safe enough that no one ever locked their doors, and the stillness of the place made it feel almost outside of time. Her home was old but cozy, filled with quilts, porcelain birds, and the scent of mint and old books. My room faced the backyard, which sloped into a thicket of tall pines and tangled underbrush, and the only light that reached it after sundown came from the small lamppost just outside the kitchen window. I liked the quiet. I liked the way the frogs croaked in the distance, and how the breeze made the tall grass sway like water. I liked reading by the window at night, the light of my small lamp casting a soft glow over the pages, while the rest of the house settled into silence. But there was one night I'll never forget, one that left something in me permanently changed. It was just after midnight. I was lying on the guest bed, half asleep with a book on my chest, when I heard a knock. Not a knock on the front door or the bedroom door, but on the window. 3 sharp taps, deliberate and rhythmic. At first I thought I had imagined it, the remnants of a dream or the shifting house settling into its beams. But then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. I turned my head slowly, expecting to see a tree branch, or maybe a bird fluttering against the pane. But what I saw stopped my breath completely. There, just outside the glass, was a man's face. His features were pale, almost colorless in the dim light, but his eyes were wide open, unblinking. He wasn't pressed up against the window, not quite, but close enough that I could see the sharpness in his cheekbones and the shadows beneath his eyes. He didn't move. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring straight at me. The shock of it paralyzed me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't look away. I just lay there, frozen, trying to convince myself that maybe I had fallen asleep and this was a dream. But it wasn't. Tut. I bolted upright and backed away from the window as quickly as I could, nearly falling off the bed. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought it might burst through my chest. I stumbled out of the room and ran down the hallway to my grandmother's room, waking her in a panic. I told her there was someone outside the window, right outside, staring at me. She didn't waste a second. She grabbed the phone and a flashlight, and we walked together back to the room. I didn't want to look, but she pulled the curtain aside and shone the flashlight out into the yard. Nothing, just grass and trees in the empty backyard. No sign of footprints, no broken twigs, no rustling bushes, nothing at all. She believed me though. She didn't tell me I was imagining things or suggest it was a trick of the light. Instead, she told me to stay in her room that night, and we locked the doors and kept the windows closed tight. The next day, she had someone come out to inspect the house just in case, but everything seemed untouched. No signs of forced entry, no marks on the glass. For a while I tried to convince myself it had been a dream. I wanted to believe it. I needed to believe it. But that image, his face stayed with me. It wasn't the look of someone who had made a mistake or gotten lost. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, and that's what terrified me most. The rest of my visit passed uneventfully. I didn't see the man again, but I started noticing small things that made me uneasy. Scratches on the outer window frame that hadn't been there before. A strand of hair caught on a low tree branch beneath the glass. The motion sensor light near the back porch going off in the middle of the night. Though no one was ever there, I stopped reading by the window. I started closing the curtains as soon as the sun went down, and I never opened them again until morning. It felt like something had shifted, like the safe little world I had known was suddenly full of things watching from the shadows. A few years later, I returned to that house for another visit, this time as a college student with friends and stories of my own. I had almost convinced myself that the man in the window had just been a hallucination, but on my second night back, my grandmother casually mentioned that a neighbor up the road had recently been arrested for prowling. She didn't know the details, only that he had been found watching people through their windows late at night. She didn't seem to connect it to what I had seen, but I did. The age, the location, everything. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a dream. It was a real person, a man who had been there watching. I never learned his name. I never asked. Part of me didn't want to know, because knowing would mean confirming that I hadn't just imagined a moment of terror. It had been real, tangible, avoidable only by luck and distance. I thought about what might have happened if I hadn't noticed him when I did, if I had kept reading, if I had opened the window for air, if I had gone outside. I couldn't stop the thoughts once they started. They followed me through adulthood, tucked in the corners of quiet nights and silent windows. They made me look twice at every passerby on dark streets, every face caught in headlights, every knock I heard when I was alone. Even now, years later, I find myself avoiding ground floor rooms. I keep curtains drawn, doors locked, lights on, not because I expect someone to appear, but because once you've seen someone watching you like that, you don't forget it. It changes something in you. It teaches you that the world isn't always as far away as it seems. Sometimes it's standing just outside the glass, waiting, and the only thing between you and it is a pane of silence.